Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. For those that don't know YIVO, we're a very special place for the celebration and cultivation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have a library and archive, which are used by researchers around the world with more than 23 million documents, over 400,000 books. And we bring to life the world of those collections with a variety of public programs like this, with classes like our Yiddish language instruction, and with exhibitions and much more. And today we've got Dr. Avi Blitz here with us today for the Tsenerene, the most popular Yiddish book in history. Avi Blitz is a graduate of Oxford University and holds a PhD in comparative literature from Indiana University. He has taught Hebrew, Yiddish, and Jewish studies in Europe, Israel, Latin America, and the US. He teaches Yiddish remotely through the Argentinian branch of YIVO, which is in Buenos Aires, and he works with beginners, intermediate, and advanced students across the Americas. Doge, is there anything you'd like to add before I hand it over?
Welcome, Baruch haba.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And a reminder to everyone, we will have a Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, put those in the Q&A function.
And don't think that by putting them in the chat, they'll end up magically in Q&A. Put them in the Q&A so we know that they are questions that need an answer by Avi at the end of the talk.
Okay.
All right, Avi, the mic is yours. Thank you so much.
I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right. So today I'm going to speak a little bit about the Tsenerene. I'm going to tell you about the title, the audience, who the book was intended for. We'll look at 3 or 4 stories from the text. We'll talk about folklore. We'll talk about some of the different versions, some different editions of the Tsenerene. And hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll have a good idea of what this book was and its place in Yiddish literature and what made it one of the most popular book in the history of Yiddish. So it's called Tsenerene, a phrase that comes from the Song of Songs, from Song of Songs 3:11. Ze'enah U-Re'enah banot Zion, v'melech Shlomo ba'atarat she'itra lo imo b'yom chatunato u'v'yom simchat libo, which means, O maidens of Zion, go forth and gaze upon King Solomon wearing the crown that his mother gave him on his wedding day, on his day of bliss. So much has been made of this title, Ze'enah U-Re'enah banot Zion. It's a feminine command. It's kind of like saying, women go and see. And the idea is that, well, if it's in the feminine, then surely it must be a book for women, a Bible for women. And indeed, this is what most people think, and it's the impression we get from modern Yiddish culture. I want to show you an excerpt from a story that I've been reading with some students recently. This is by Dora Schulner. And she says, in der Weiberscher Schule ist de Woire die Sogerin gesessen Eugen on und gesorgt dem Munzane Tokef, aber sie hat es wie herausgesorgt von der Tsenerene. De Woire hat mit ihr feiner Stimme gelehnt und wir alle haben geschwungen ihre Wörter Wort für Wort. Alle Weile hat sich ein bitter Gewehen getrogen über der Weiberscher Schule. Überhaupt will ich verzeichnen, wie schön de Woire die Sogerin hat für uns übergegeben, dem Ze'enah U-Re'enah. So, de Woire the Zogerin sat at the head of the women's synagogue and recited the Unsane Tokef. But she recited it as if from the Tsenerene. De Woire read with a fine voice, and we all devoured what she said word by word. All the while, bitter cries extended over the women's synagogue. Above all, I want to note how beautifully de Woire the Zogerin imparted the Tsenerene to us. Why am I starting with this? Well, because I want to show you some of the ideas we've got about the Tsenerene that come from modern Yiddish culture. We have in this little excerpt, which is an autobiographical story, all the symbols of femininity that we imagine in the Yiddish world. The Zogerin, who's probably the rabbi's wife or the rabbi's daughter who leads the women in prayer. We've got bitter cries, which is a symbol of women's piety. We've got the Tsenerene. Modern Yiddish is replete with images, with juxtapositions of the Tsenerene with women's piety. We see it in Shlomo Reb Chaim's by Mendele Moches Forim. We see it in the 1937 film Der Dibbuk. We have a scene with a woman reading a Tsenerene. And in Ansky's ethnographic questionnaire, also the question is posed, do women still read the Tsenerene? Which is to say that in modern Yiddish culture, everyone imagined that this was a book for women. Dora Shulner's story, written in her new home in Chicago, looks back to her native Kiev with nostalgia for a place where women read the Tsenerene and wept. But this actually is a bit of a misrepresentation. The first misrepresentation is the title of the book. Here we have the frontispiece to the 1663 edition, and you can see here it says, Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and then underneath, Ze'enah U-Re'enah Banot Zion. So it's like the title is actually Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and Tsenerene is a subtitle. And we see the same thing also in other editions. This one from 1710, Chamisha Chumshei Torah Balashon Ashkenaz. And then underneath, Ze'enah U-Re'enah Banot Zion. Here from 1711, Chamisha Chumshei Torah Balashon Ashkenaz. And this one, the subtitle here is really small. Ze'enah U-Re'enah Banot Zion is in little letters. So why was it called? Tsenerene? Well, this was probably to distinguish it from earlier editions, earlier translations of the Chumash. Here in this slide, we see a Chumash from 1560. This is by Rabbi Judah ben Moshe Naftali Bresk, one of three translations of the Chumash into Yiddish that were made in the 16th century, under the title Chamisha Chumshei Torah. So Tsenerene becomes Tsenerene to distinguish it from these earlier books. Here's a bit more of the Cremona Chumash. The second misrepresentation in Dora Shulner's story is who actually read the Tsenerene. Was it for women? Was it for everyone? Who used it? To understand this, we have to think about what Yiddish meant in early modern Ashkenaz. And David Katz gives us a really nice way of thinking about a hierarchy of Jewish languages in traditional Ashkenazi culture. We have at the bottom Yiddish, then we've got Hebrew, and then Aramaic at the top. Who knew these languages? Well, scholars and rabbis, the religious elite, all were versed in Aramaic, obviously, because they had to deal with the Talmud, the Gemara, they were reading Jewish law. Men were versed in Hebrew, they were reading the Torah, and everybody was speaking Yiddish. So we have this kind of distinction between Lashon Kodesh, which is the holy language, Aramaic and Hebrew, and Mamalosh, Yiddish, which is the language of everyone. And we kind of can think of this in a binary of Mamalosh being the women's language and Lashon Kodesh being Vatersprach, the father tongue, the language of God. But actually this is very neat. It's a neat way of thinking about languages. The truth is a lot more complicated. One way we can think about who was reading Yiddish and whether men were actually reading Yiddish is to look at the Hagdomas to much Old Yiddish literature. The Hagdomas are the prefaces the forewords. And it gets very complicated when we start doing that. So in Merkeves HaMishnah, which is the first printed book in Yiddish from 1534, it's a kind of a dictionary of biblical terms. I think we can see here a little bit in the background. Alav means tzu'im, alea, tzu'ir. In the preface to this book, it says that women can use it to teach their sons. So Yiddish was being used by women and by the children too. In the Cremona Chumash that we just saw earlier, it says, "For our many sins we have not studied enough, and the women, maidens, and young girls see that the men have not learned, so they also do not learn. Men would like to learn that which they didn't or couldn't learn in their youth, and in their old days they want to study the weekly portion, but are ashamed to do so with the commentary of a rabbi." So Rabbi Judah, the author of this translation, wants his text to be useful for everyone, for men and also for women. Sefer Midas, which is a book that explores the vices and virtues of human beings, of people, says that this book is for men and also for women. And the Brandspiegel from 1602 by Moshe Chenoch has a very long preface where Moshe Chenoch talks about how men are so detached from religion, they're so removed from their customs. It laments men's lack of learning, and it says, well, Brandspiegel, I should mention, means burning mirror, and he says to his readers, you should treat this book like a mirror for your soul. Look into it and cleanse your soul. And then he gives us the famous phrase, Das Buch wird gemacht teitsch für Weiber und Mannen, die das sein als Weiber. For women and for men who are like women, which means men who don't know Hebrew. Teitsch, by the way, is the term that Yiddish was known by. Yiddish wouldn't be called Yiddish for another 300 years. We could speak about the introductions and prefaces to Old Yiddish literature for the whole hour, but suffice to say that the question of Old Yiddish and gender is a fraught one over which much ink has been spilled. For example, Israel Zinberg, Volhynia-born Jewish historian, says that the idea that Old Yiddish literature was for women is an exaggeration made by 19th century German scholars of Judaism. Shmuel Charny, who was born into a Lubavitch family and gave up his rabbinic studies to become one of the greatest Yiddish literary critics of the 20th century, says that actually Old Yiddish was just for women, it was for women. David Katz says that with the Tsenerene, an erstwhile male world opened up to the female reader in one fell swoop. But Morris Feuerstein says it's much more complicated. He agrees with Zinberg, but he adds that Maskilim, Bundists, Hebraists, anti-religious communists of the 19th century, all of these people added to the perception that Old Yiddish was just it was a language for women. The Tsenerene, says Morris Feuerstein, was read by everyone. Max Eric calls Jacob ben Yitskhok Ashkenazi, the author of the Tsenerene, the Luther of the Middle Yiddish period. That's because he democratized Jewish knowledge for everybody. And actually, if we look at the different versions of the text and we look at the sophistication and breadth of the work, we'll realize how this could have spoken to everyone, not just women. So let's dive in and look at the text. I'm going to read to you a little bit from the Yiddish, and then we'll look at a translation, and then we'll discuss. Okay, so it begins. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In ersten Bescheffens Himmel und Erd, da ist gewesen die Erd wüst und leer, und finster an den Abgrund. Und der Kisser Kovet von der Kodesh Baruch Hu ist gestanden in Luften über die Wasser. Und warum hat die Torah angefangen mit der Base? Lernt uns, wie es ein Base, die hat 3 Seiten. Okay. So this means, when God began to create heaven and earth, that's the Hebrew bit that we read. In the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth was desolate, empty, and darkness was over the void. The Holy One's throne of glory hovered in the air over the water. Why did the Torah begin with the letter Bet? It teaches us that the world is similar to the Bet that has 3 sides and the 4th is open. So too is the world. The Holy One closed 3 sides, and on the north side, the Holy One did not make a heaven. Why? The Holy One wanted to say to the nations of the world, let your false gods come and let them close the 4th wall. Since you have chosen them as gods, let them see what they can do. Okay. So, if we go back to the text for a second, you can see that, first of all, the text is arranged according to the parasha, Bereshit at the top. It's the first parasha of the Chumash. It begins in Hebrew, and it's written in Meruba script. And then it goes into Mashkit or Weiberteich. It's a font that was developed in the 16th century and fell out of fashion in the mid-19th century for Yiddish. This introduction, this beginning of the text, immediately takes us deep into the world of Jewish folklore. Isn't this just a midrash, you might ask? What has midrash got to do with folklore? Isn't folklore to do with oral storytelling? Well, not necessarily. Jewish society was always highly literate, and folklore is woven into the fabric of our classical texts, particularly Aggadic midrash, stories from the Talmud, the great commentary, and beyond. And I want to read you just a little bit from Howard Schwartz, who's going to explain how Jewish texts and folklore work together. A largely unrecognized but quite extensive mythology is embedded throughout Jewish literature. The primary myths portrayed in the Bible, especially those in Genesis, became the focus of mythic elaboration. The biblical text packs a maximum amount of meaning into a minimum number of words, thereby compelling interpretation. An ancient rabbinic method of exegesis called midrash, which sought out and inevitably found the solution to problems perceived in the biblical text, resulted in the creation of an abundant mythology that eventually took on a life of its own. Often the transformation that takes place between the early periods of Jewish myth and their later evolution is considerable, almost constituting a new set of myths based on the old ones. The sum of all these generations of reimagining of Bible is a Jewish mythology as rich as that of other great ancient cultures. These myths may appear either in fully developed form or as widely scattered fragments. Often when these fragments are collected from the extant sources and pieced back together, they reveal extensive elaboration of the original myths, often in unexpected directions. And indeed, the Tsenerene is full of such fragments of myth, midrash, stories, pieced together. It's a book that sifts biblical, Talmudic, midrashic literature and presents a seamless text that reflects the folkloric beliefs of early modern Ashkenazi society. Oh, sorry. We have, for example, in this, what we just read, reference to the Kiseh Koved, the heavenly throne. This does not appear in the Hebrew. The Kisei HaKoved is actually from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, an 8th or 9th century midrash. We have a story about the fourth corner of the world being left open, so that the gods of other people can come and complete it, a kind of challenge to the other religions of the world, which is a very old myth. Another version of the myth exists in Midrash Hagadol, a 14th century collection of midrashim, where the letter Bet is described as having 3 sides closed and a fourth open, because it teaches us that in life we're not supposed to ask what's above us, what's below us, and what's ahead of us. Stories about letters dominate many folk traditions. Turning letters into pictorial symbols and connecting them to poetic narratives echoes ancient practices of casting runes, reading tarot, cleromancy, lithomancy. Connected to this is also gematria. We find stories about letters in the Talmud. For example, in Tractate Shabbat, there's a story about the Gimel and the Daled, who represent the ideals of giving charity. Gimel gives and Daled humbly accepts with his back to Gimel. In Abraham Abulafia's Sefer Ha'ot from the 13th century, stories about letters take on a truly transcendental power. The Tsenerene is full of stories about letters. In an elaboration of a commentary by Rashi, for example, the Tsenerene says that the letter Hey shows us the journey we all take when we die. We all fall out the bottom. Except there's a little opening here that means if you've been good, you can pass up into heaven. We have a story in the Tsenerene about the letter Yud, the smallest letter in the alphabet. The Yud from the phrase Jene Welt, which means the other world. It shows how the mighty will be humbled when they are cast down into Jene Welt. Jene Welt, by the way, there are 2 terms for the world to come: Olam Haba, Olam Haba, and Jene Welt. One is the good place, and one is the not so good place. So if you go to the not so good place, the Yud from Jene Welt shows you that you'll be brought low and humbled in that awful place. And this particular story is quite fascinating because the stories about letters are usually connected to Hebrew terms, but here the Tsenerene gives us a kind of midrash on a Yiddish term. When the Israelites paint blood over their doors when the angel of death passes over Egypt, it's actually a letter Chet, and it stands for Chaim, meaning life. Perhaps you've heard these stories before. Perhaps you got them from a teacher when you were a child. Maybe that teacher got them from a teacher from a previous generation who might have heard them from the Tsenerene. This is the interplay between storytelling, the text, and folklore. The opening to the Tsenerene remained unchanged for 200 years. And then this. This is from an edition published in 1895 in Vilna. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim vet haaretz. In ersten Beschäfnis von Himmel und Erd ist gewesen die Erd wisst und leer, und der Kisei HaKoved von Gott hat geschwebt in der Luften über dem Wasser. So we have that same opening. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and then the translation, in the beginning, the earth was void and empty, and the heavenly throne of God hovered in the air over the water. And then, und warum hebt sich die Torah on mit der Beis? Why does the Torah begin with the letter Beis? Zu weisen, as der Beis is Bracha. To show that the bet stands for the word Bracha, which means blessing. Darum hat Kodesh Baruch Hu angehäuben mit der Beis. That's why God began with the letter Beis. This story actually appears also in the in the edition we saw earlier. But gone here is the story about the fourth corner of creation. And the question is, why? Well, I always say Yiddish encompasses every impulse in modern Jewish history. The Hasidic, the Misnagdic, the Orthodox, the Maskilic, the Zionist, the Bundist, the secular, religious, leftist. I think that this text omits the story about the fourth corner of the world being left open as a challenge, because it may be a Maskilic edition, a text that belongs to proponents of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. People who perhaps were open to other cultures and didn't want to challenge the religions and beliefs of their neighbors. So the anthological style of the Tsenerene meant that it was easy for later redactors to edit the material, adding, taking away, and changing the text to suit different ideologies and new generations of readers, ensuring the continued popularity of the work. Okay, time for another story. This one comes from Megillas Esther. Okay. So Megillas Esther is in the Tsenerene is a book that's full of outrageous, sometimes outrageous midrashim, as we'll see. And I want to read you this one. This actually comes from the Sudilkov edition of the Tsenerene, published in 1819. Sudilkov, today it's called Sudilkiv in Ukraine. It's about 100 miles away from Berdichev. And for those of you who know a bit about Hasidic history, will know that that's kind of the lands of Hasidism. Indeed, Chonesh Merok said that this is a Hasidic version of the text. If what we just saw was a Maskilic version, this is actually from a Hasidic sphere. So let's have a read. Vayahi omen et Hadassah. Der Midrash Yalkut schreibt in Neuech, wie Esther klein war, sucht Mordechai ein Freu, was sie sollt säugen. Konnte keine funden. Da nimmt Mordechai sein Brust und gibt zu säugen Esther und war sie aufziehen mit seiner Milch. Darum hat sie gehalten für eine Tochter. This means Mordechai was a foster father to Hadassah. The Yalkut in the portion of Noah said Esther was very young and Mordechai sought someone to nurse Esther. But he could not find any woman. Mordechai took his own breast and gave it to Esther to nurse, and he raised her with his milk. When the maiden came into the house, he considered her a daughter. This somewhat wild text disappears in the 1895 Vilna edition, the one that I called Maskilic. The question is why? Was it too irrational for the late 19th century editors of that particular Tsenerene? Or perhaps the story in some way perpetuates the hated anti-Semitic myth of a feminized Jewish male. We might remember the myth of the anti-Semitic myth that Jewish men were not quite like real men. They might have menstruated during Holy Week. So maybe this text was erased in reaction to that. Sadly, we can't be sure. We can't ask the editors what they were thinking when they took this out. But it's quite fascinating to consider why these changes happen. In the English too, we can see that, and I've put in square brackets, that this version that Maurice Feinstein bases his translation on, the 1711 Amsterdam edition, has things that the version that we just saw from Sudilkov doesn't have. It says Mordechai had no evil inclination to Esther. So while Sudilkov readers can just enjoy the wild story about Mordechai for its own right, the readers of the Amsterdam edition were told by the text, lest you think this is just a bawdy Purim story, actually this is really a story about how Mordechai was pious. We are told how to understand the story. And this is something that the text does a lot. It controls how we read. Very often, the voice of the Tsenerene will come in. We'll have a midrash, and then the voice of the Tsenerene will come in and say, this means that, der Teretz is, the reason for this is. And for example, there's a story about Deborah in the field judging Israel, and the text says she was outside because if she'd been inside, then maybe people would think that she was with a strange man. So the text is always concerned to tell us what we should take away from the stories and to impart a kind of a moral lesson. Let's have another story. This one, hold on. Es war ein Meister an ein Sar. Der war ein weiten Weg vorn von seinem Weib. Da nimmt der Sar ein Eventov, der da heißt Brisant, und war betten sein Weib, nimm den Brisant und trog ihm an deinem Holz, der warten, dass du sollst meiner gedenken, derweil ich veräußern bleibe. Let's see what happens. There was a story about a nobleman who was on a long journey far from his wife. The nobleman took a precious stone named Topaz. He commanded his wife, take the topaz and wear it on your neck, expecting that you should remember me since I will be away. The woman took the topaz and hung it on her neck. She engaged in illicit sex while her husband was away. When the nobleman came home, the nobleman said, where is the topaz? She showed it to him, and it was split apart, since the topaz cannot tolerate illicit sex. It will split if someone wears it and has illicit sex. The nobleman said to his wife, why is the stone split? She was so embarrassed that she did not know what to answer. This story appears as part of a string of stories that the Tsenerene weaves around the stones that are described in the priestly breastplate in Parsha Tetzaveh. And it evinces anxiety about sexual propriety, which is a perennial theme in the book. It recalls also folk beliefs about magic and the natural world. Barachot, in Tractate Barachot, in the Babylonian Talmud, Rav Huna says that all of us have 1,000 demons to our right and 1,000 demons to our left. And early modern Ashkenaz was no different. It was a place full of dangers, dibukim, shadim, demons, evil eyes, and people did use stones to protect them. They thought of these stones as sternshis, fragments of shooting stars. And actually, the rabbinical authorities permitted people to use them. They permitted women to wear them on Shabbat because they believed that they would protect them. The Tsenerene sifts the textual tradition for material most relevant to its pedagogical mission. Why does it give us this explanation of a topaz, for example? There are other sources. There are many, many other stories in Jewish folklore about topaz. A topaz can turn evil into good. Bachya ben Asher, Rabbeinu Bachya, who is a medieval Spanish commentator whom the Tsenerene draws on a lot, he says that the topaz is good for digestion. If you're having trouble digesting food, you can wear a topaz and it'll help you. The Ishbitzer Rebbe, who's much later, of course, Mordechai Lehner, says that the topaz can give us Torah knowledge. The choice to include this particular story tells us about the concern of the text's desire to control its readers, and specifically, perhaps in this case, also women. It says that if you do something bad, you'll be found out. This text kind of supports the idea that the Tsenerene was a chumash for women, because it seems to be the case that they're the ones over whom control is being exerted. But there are almost 300 editions of the Tsenerene. It was published, edited, changed, and the text was not stable, either for linguistic reasons or for ideological reasons, as we saw. 20th century editions of the text published in Vienna, early 20th century editions published in Vienna, don't include this story of the dalliance that was discovered by a gemstone. In its most radical iteration, a French Tsenerene published in 1846, 50 years before our Maskilic version from Vilna, changes almost everything. This text was put together by Alexandre Créange, one of the founders of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and the text evinces the values of the French Revolution, to which Créange so dearly held. For example, it's set out like a play, and if the early editions of the Tsenerene seek to tell us how to read the stories, what we should be taking away from the stories, this one does the exact opposite. Here it says that the father is reading to the children, and it says, I'm not going to read you in French, but I'll translate it. Each of us has our way of seeing, of feeling. We're all differently impressed by the things that touch us, by the objects that surround us. And if we were called upon, each one of us, to share that which interested us the most in a narrative, you would be surprised, my children, by the difference of opinions that present themselves among us. Not to linger too long outside the confines of Yiddish land, however, I just want to point out that this French Tsenerene raises, again, the issue of readership. It says here, show the children the picture, and we're reminded by the picture of images from the earliest editions of the Ze'enah U-Re'enah. Was the Tsenerene used to educate children? Was that its purpose? Indeed, in Jerusalem, in discussions I've had with ultra-Orthodox Jews, I've been told that mothers will read this text to their children. But maybe this reads too much into the pictures. The tradition of illustrating Yiddish books goes back to the 16th century, and some editors of the Tsenerene react strongly against the pictures. In the 1711 Amsterdam edition, the editor praises the usefulness of the pictures for young readers before thanking God that his edition of the Tsenerene will not include any illustrations. This speaks to the very nature of the text and why it's so hard to pin down. Chava Toniansky calls it an open source. It's a text that can accommodate different elements. Things can be removed and added. There are paratextual elements like the pictures. And these variances trace the relationship between the storytelling traditions, Jewish storytelling traditions, and the folk. The alterations in the text reflect the vicissitudes of Yiddish-speaking life and ideology. In his 1897 work, Shalom al Yisrael, Eliezer Zweifel wrote that the Jewish life in the modern world has been shaped by the conflict that began in the time of the Besht, the Baal Shem Tov, the Gaon Eliyahu, and Mendelssohn. And as the Tsenerene was refracted through the prisms of Hasidism, Lithuanian Orthodoxy, and the Jewish Enlightenment, it took on new forms and changed. as we've seen, some editions may be more, let's say, rational. I don't want to use that word, but for want of a better word, some of the texts are very didactic. Some seem targeted for children. Some editions include a siddur, the part of the siddur that for Shabbat morning at the beginning, indicating that the text may have been used in the synagogue. Other editions include calendars, indicating that perhaps the Tsenerene had a practical use in the family. If we go back to our Hasidic text, the 1819 Sudilkov edition, this includes Abraham ibn Ezra's Sabbath epistle, from a medieval Spanish text, which describes the Sabbath bride visiting the philosopher in a dream. The Sabbath bride is a Kabbalistic myth from the Middle Ages, and it kind of supports the idea that this text was indeed a Hasidic version. Why would Kabbalah support the idea that this was Hasidic? Because Hasidism, which began in a small corner of Volhynia in the 1700s, drew heavily from the Kabbalah and was a mystical movement, and it also raised up the status of Yiddish. Hasidism, in the Hasidic cloys, stories would be told in Yiddish. The Rebbes would give their droshes in Yiddish. So Yiddish was the male language among Hasidim. Our perception of this book has been shaped by writers like Dora Schulner, Mendele, Ansky, the modern Yiddish culture that we spoke about at the beginning of this talk. They've all contributed to this idea that this was just a woman's text. But who really read the Tsenerene? Everyone. Men, women, children, in the synagogue, in the home, in the Hasidic cloys. The text's success was down to its ability to change and adapt to new generations. Another reason is simpler. One of my teachers, Abraham Lichtenboim, says that we're not just Homo sapiens, we are Homo Mises. Mise is the Yiddish word for a story. And the Tsenerene is the ultimate storybook. So today we've spoken about the representation of the text in modern Yiddish culture. We spoke about the title. We talked about Old Yiddish readership, who read Old Yiddish. We looked at a few of the stories and spoke about differences between the stories and the different versions. And we looked at some of the different paratextual elements of the book, pictures, the extra text that were included. So I hope this topic has piqued your interest and perhaps made you want to go and see Ze'enah U-Re'enah for yourselves. Okay, so I guess now we can have some questions.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk, and there's a lot of really interesting questions already. And I'll just say that if you're out there in the audience, you have a question, please put it in the chat. Sorry, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. So we'll be able to keep track of it. So there's a bunch of questions about just different sources for further study. You mentioned that you'd call it an open source, and so which are the textual sources that people should be looking to for getting to know this, and also what is your feeling about translation into English or other languages? And there are some specific questions about the Firestein translation. Rebecca Glazer says, what do you think of Firestein's translation of the Tsenerene? Does it lose something in being translated out of Yiddish? Is there a critical Yiddishness to the Tsenerene as a text, or is there value in an English translation outside of a scholarly research application? And I'll just mention, also there's the Art Scroll translation. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, which is clearly meant for application, not for research.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so a few questions, yeah.
Good questions. Well, regarding Maurice Firestein's translation, it is out of this world. I mean, it really is exceptional. He gives references to where things come from. He's sourced where the midrashim and which parts of the Talmud and which parts of the stories, which commentators the text is. It really is an archaeology of the entire text. So it is extremely useful, and it's extremely useful also in conjunction with the different versions. If you look at it and you think, well, why did that text disappear? How did it change? Why did this little instruction disappear in that later edition? So I think it's a great tool and a fabulous starting place to see just also how broad the Tsenerene is and the breadth of sources that Jacob ben Isaac Ashkenazi draws from in this text.
And do you have any thoughts about the Art Scroll translation, or?
I think you said it was for practical application. I of course I know the Art Scroll. It's a lovely edition. I think it has illustrations in it too, right?
Let's see.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Yes, there are some. Absolutely, yeah. There is.
Yes, I think it has. That's right, from the older editions. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. So you spoke about literacy and about the different kind of levels of literacy in Yiddish versus Hebrew versus Aramaic. How common was literacy, period, though? Among women, but also among men?
That's a very hard question to answer. If we consider literacy, if we consider Yiddish within the question of literacy, then I think the numbers shoot up. And we can certainly say that Jewish communities were far more literate than their non-Jewish counterparts, if we consider Yiddish. If we don't, then it obviously changes. And I think the prefaces that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, like Moshe Chanoch's from the Brand Spiegel, who's lamenting the loss of Jewish knowledge, it's a very, very common way to start these old Yiddish texts. It's a very common theme in the Musa Sforim of the 17th century. So I think people were, it's kind of like the idea that every generation is less good than the one that came before it, right? So yeah, there is a kind of loss of Hebrew learning, yeah.
Before we move on to a different topic, there's a bunch more questions about just versions for study now. Like what is, for example, one question, what is the latest version or edition of the Tsenerene? And yeah, who is publishing it? Who's reading it today? Is it still being read today, other than by scholars?
It's still being read today. In fact, if you go to Meir Sharim in Jerusalem, you can buy a copy. And it's from my conversations with ultra-Orthodox Jews there, some of them will give this book to their betrothed, their fiancés, as a kind of a wedding gift. I think the edition I saw in Meir Sharim was published in 2006. It's a beautiful leather-bound edition. So it is still being published.
And in terms of Yiddish students that are curious to read it, is there a particular edition you would point them to?
Oh, that's a very good question, because obviously, if you saw from the text that I showed you, it can be difficult to read. You've got the issue of Mashkit, which is a different script. Yiddish isn't, the Yiddish orthography isn't really standardized until Mendeley comes along, and that whole process of standardizing orthography begins. So it's hard, but I think a modern version, the most recent version, why not? Could be a good one to start with. Yeah. Or the 1711 Amsterdam edition with Maurice Feierstein's translation. I think that those two together could be a nice place to start.
Oh, wonderful. And someone just asks, speaking of Maurice Feierstein, do you have the exact name of that book for those that want to?
I think it's just called Ze'enah U-Re'enah, a critical translation.
Maurice Feierstein.
Let's just have a look. I'll tell you right now. Yes, Ze'enah U-Re'enah, a critical translation into English. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of different questions about that, but for the record, that's the recommended English translation.
It is. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. How much? Another viewer asks, how much did the Tsenerene stay a part of Jewish life across, the immigration that happened in the 20th century, both to America, but also to pre-state Israel and the modern state?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. The Tsenerene was published, I think, in there were several editions published in Tel Aviv in the 40s, which showed that in the post-war period, I think immediately after, in 46, 47, there are a couple of editions published. So it's still relevant here. I don't know, maybe the reasons why it was published so soon after the war, maybe reclaiming our traditions. There's all sorts of reasons why it could be the case. Also in America, there was an edition published in New York in 27, and several editions in New York, actually. So I think it definitely survived Jewish migration, but I think maybe less and less people read it. Yeah.
But it's interesting to think about the way that it filtered into education, like the anecdote you gave, where people kind of hear these stories, but they don't necessarily know where they came from. Do you have any other thoughts about that, or about the way that you talked about how these stories in it came from midrash, but do you have any thoughts about how it's the role that the Tsenerene played in kind of perpetuating the midrash and making it widespread?
That's a very hard thing to answer too, because I mean, if we talk about folklore, obviously we've got these texts in the Tsenerene. We can see how they change from version to version sometimes, and really the changes can be very minute. But this was the source for a lot of these stories. People were reading it to children. They were reading it at home. It was kind of like the Meisterbuch is another example of a book that was widely read, and people were getting stories from, and obviously telling these stories again to children, maybe without a copy of the book, or maybe in a forum where they didn't have access to the text. They were talking from memory. So that's how these stories get passed around, right? I mean, yeah, it's kind of fascinating to think how transmission happened.
Along those lines, is two kind of opposing questions that I could ask you to consider together. One viewer asks, can you talk about the entertainment value of this text and the way that perhaps that shifted over time? And another viewer posits, well, isn't the idea of the Tsenerene to give Jews a way to live by Jewish law? So yeah, these are two opposing takes. I wonder your thoughts on that question.
Yeah. I think first of all, I think it's extremely, as we saw, it's very entertaining. We've got lots of little stories, midrashim, sometimes extremely wild stories, and yeah, we are. It's kind of like we didn't have Netflix back then, so people read stories. So absolutely, it had entertainment value. With regards to the law, I think the Tsenerene is concerned with the relationship between men and women, between Jews and non-Jews. It's concerned with kashrut. It's concerned with the community. And I think those things come up again and again and again. You'll have a story in the Tsenerene, and then it'll tell you how to interpret the story. This means that you should give tzedakah. This means that you should make sure you're never in a home alone, or because maybe somebody would suspect you of doing something. It's always concerned with how you're seen, what's your role in society, in the Jewish community. And I think that is really the emphasis. In terms of law, it's more about, I guess, it's about behavior. It's less about the finer points, the kleine pitchavkas of halacha. For that, you'd go and study the Talmud, I guess. But there is certainly a legal dimension to this. It was a book that was read, but the stories were taken as truth in some cases. You know, this is, if I spoke about the stones in Parshat Tetzaveh, this was serious stuff. People believed this. There are stories in the Tsenerene about the evil eye. That was a very serious thing. The Tsenerene says that we're in exile because of the evil eye that was cast on us. And how do you get rid of the evil eye? You give charity. So, yeah.
I was speaking about the story of the Topaz stone. One viewer asks, are the characters in that little vignette, are those Jews or non-Jews? Is that a relevant question to be asking? And if so, yeah, how does that kind of relate to the nature of this as a moral story?
I'm not sure that's really relevant, whether they're Jewish or not. There are stories in the Tsenerene about kings and ministers, and we see things that may sort of have a sort of a non-Jewish tone. A minister. I mean, I think in the text it says der Sar, which means the minister was going away. Can we imagine that a minister was Jewish or not? What would people reading this text in the 1600s have thought? Would they have believed that this was a Jewish minister? I'm not sure. I think the moral of the story is more important than the Jewishness. I think in that case, at least.
Fascinating. Going back to the actual text of it itself. Two questions about the text. One is the Yiddish more modern in the more modern versions, you know, in terms of the orthography and other features of the Yiddish, perhaps it's easier to read one, fewer posits. And another question about the Yiddish is how much of the actual, you know, we saw that quote of Bereshis at the beginning, how much do we actually get the kind of Chumash in its original versus Yiddish?
Those are good questions. Okay, so with regards to the ease of reading, the Tsenerene remained pretty much unchanged for 200 years. When printing was in the great centers of Yiddish printing like Amsterdam and Frankfurt, when Yiddish printing moved east to places like Vilna, that's when the Tsenerene, the language of the Tsenerene was changed and brought much more in line with the spoken language of its readers. So there is an argument. I mean, I think Morris Feinstein has this, says that Chonesh Merok's idea about the Hasidic Tsenerene is a bit of an exaggeration because actually these changes were linguistic. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think there are definitely content changes to the Tsenerene. So it's not just linguistic, it's also content, but the language was easier to read, certainly in the newer versions, because it was brought in line with the spoken language much more. And with regards to how much Chumash is in the Tsenerene, that can vary from parsha to parsha. It's organized according to the weekly reading. And sometimes you can just have a tiny fragment of text and then reams of stories. So sometimes more than others. It changes. It's worth looking at though. Go and see. Yeah.
That's the theme of these questions. And I'll just say we're running out of time. We'll do a few more questions. But you know, it's obviously a really interesting topic. And because it's elicited so many questions here. So my apologies in advance for the many that we don't get to. One question is about the geographic spread of the Tsenerene, and also the Jewish ethnic Jewish or different Jewish language relationship to it. For example, were was this text known to Sephardic communities, or communities speaking other Jewish languages such as Ladino? We spoke today about it being accessible in Yiddish, of course, and also English and French. Are there other kind of contours of that to think about in the Jewish world?
I don't think there's a Judeo-Arabic version of this. I think there's something. Me'am Lo'ez is a kind of the Sephardi text, which is often compared to the Tsenerene, which is also a collection of midrashim. I'm not sure how much the Sephardi world would have known about the Tsenerene. Certainly with regards to its centers of printing, they were Vilna, Lvov, Vienna, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, as I mentioned before, and after in the 20th century, New York and Israel too. But I guess today, perhaps there's more awareness among Sephardi Jews about the Tsenerene, especially in religious communities. In Mea Shearim, you find some. There are Sephardi Jews who become Hasidic, who join Hasidic groups. And in some Hasidic groups in Jerusalem, there is a lot of respect for Yiddish, and people really strive to try and learn it. Yeah.
There are so many great questions, but that might be a good place for us to stop. Thank you so much, Avi. This has been really fascinating, and we really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hey. All right. Well, we'll edit the recording there, but I can leave the room open for a few minutes if you want to take a look at any of the other questions. And if anyone wants to share anything with the chat, we've got a nice big audience here today. And my apologies again to the many questions we didn't get to. It was really a ton of really interesting questions. I'm curious myself.
Oh, were other gemstones mentioned in the Bible that are referenced in the Tzena? Yes. Oh yeah, all the ones from Parshat Tetzaver about the priestly breastplate, and the Tzena tells what each stone will do.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I can't remember all of them. I just remember that the ruby is a good one if you're pregnant. The ruby will look after you. Make sure you don't. Yeah, so there's things about sapphires which bring knowledge and all sorts of things. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's lots of interesting questions about the afterlife and about literacy. More people want to talk about Art Scroll, but another day.
Another day.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Avi. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And I look forward to reading the dissertation.
Oh, absolutely. I will send it. All right. Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
And just for those out in the audience, I'll just remind you, we've got a lot of great talks coming up. The talk this Thursday with Miriam Trin has actually been postponed until next Thursday. So we're off on Thursday, but we'll be back next Tuesday. And again, next Thursday, let me just pull up the calendar here. So on Tuesday, we've got Shachar Pinsker on When Yiddish Was Young in Israel. And then next Thursday, rather than this Thursday, we've got Miriam Trin about Chaim Grada. Chaim Grada's Two Faces, Poetry and Prose. And that brings us to the close of this year's Yiddish Civilization lecture series. You can watch the past events on our YouTube channel. And stay tuned for our fall announcement. We're going to be off for August, planning lots of exciting stuff, and back in September with a lot of really interesting lectures and panels and concerts and theatrical readings. So stay tuned. More about that to come. Thank you all for joining us.